Long before cities rose across continents and highways traced bright lines through the night, the earth moved through a quieter rhythm. Winds crossed enormous plains untouched by fences. Rivers wandered freely through valleys, where forests stretched farther than the eye could follow. Ice still clung to the northern world, vast white sheets reflecting pale sunlight across frozen horizons. At first glance, the planet might have looked familiar. The mountains stood where mountains stand today. The oceans breathed with the same slow tides. Yet something about this ancient Earth was different, in a way that is difficult to imagine now. The difference was scale. Across the open grasslands moved herds of mammoths, their curved tusks glinting faintly beneath cold skies. They travelled slowly, like drifting hills of fur and bone, leaving wide paths through snow and tall grass. Nearby, creatures that resembled enormous armadillos lumbered across the ground, their armoured shells catching the low light of early mornings. In the forests, giant ground sloths moved with surprising calm, towering upright to pull branches down with long, deliberate claws. Predators followed these giants. Along the edges of valleys, saber-toothed cats watched patiently from the shadows. Their bodies were powerful and silent, built for brief explosions of speed. When they moved with precision, selecting their moment carefully among animals that could weigh several tons. The balance between hunter and prey was delicate, refined through thousands of generations. This world was not empty wilderness. It was a living system built around enormous life. Scientists now use a simple word to describe these creatures: megafauna. The term refers to animals far larger than most species alive today, but the word itself hardly captures the reality of that ancient world. Nearly every continent supported giants. Mammoths and mastodons roamed the northern plains. Giant kangaroos leapt across Australian landscapes. Massive bison with horns, wider than modern cars, thundered across the grasslands of North America. Even the birds were sometimes enormous. In certain regions, flightless predators taller than a human stalked open terrain, their powerful legs carrying them swiftly over long distances. They hunted smaller animals with sharp beaks and relentless endurance. To stand in such a landscape would have felt like stepping into a world where the scale of life had been turned upward. Yet the most striking thing about this prehistoric Earth was not simply the presence of giants. It was the balance they created. Large herbivores shaped entire ecosystems as they moved. Their grazing kept forests from spreading across open plains. Their migrations distributed seeds and nutrients across vast territories. Predators followed the rhythms of these herds, ensuring that populations remained healthy and stable. Life moved in patterns that repeated year after year, century after century. For millions of years, this balance endured. Then, within a surprisingly short span of time, the giants began to disappear. The mammoths faded from the plains. The giant sloths vanished from the forests. The massive predators that once hunted among them slipped quietly from the record of life. Across continents, animals that had survived countless climate shifts suddenly ceased to exist. Today the landscapes remain, but something about them feels smaller. Forests grow where herds once walked. Grasslands stretch across horizons that no longer tremble beneath the weight of enormous animals. The question lingers in the silence left behind. If the planet once supported so many giants, why does our world seem so different now? Somewhere beneath deserts, forests, and riverbanks, fragments of bone still rest in the earth, waiting patiently. They are quiet witnesses to a time when the scale of life was greater than anything we see today, and they hint that the story of those vanished giants may be far more complex than it first appears. The world of giants might seem distant now, almost like a half-remembered dream of the planet's past. Yet fragments of that ancient world still exist, resting quietly in places most people rarely see. They lie in museum drawers inside climate-controlled vaults, or beneath glass displays where visitors pass by without always realizing what they are looking at. Bones, some of them enormous. When the first fossils of prehistoric megafauna began to appear in the 18th and 19th centuries, they puzzled nearly everyone who saw them. Farmers digging wells sometimes struck massive bones buried beneath layers of soil. Quarry workers uncovered strange skeletons locked in ancient rock. In riverbanks and eroding hillsides, pieces of ivory or fossilized bone occasionally emerged from the earth, as if the past itself had briefly surfaced. At first, many people had no language for what they were seeing. Some believed these bones belonged to giants described in ancient stories. Others assumed they were the remains of enormous animals that had somehow survived the Great Flood narratives common in early historical thinking. Only gradually did naturalists begin to understand that these bones represented species that had lived long before recorded human history. As collections grew, the scale of prehistoric life became impossible to ignore. Fossils revealed giant bison with horns stretching wider than modern cars. Skeletons of enormous ground sloths suggested animals taller than elephants when they stood upright. In parts of South America, paleontologists uncovered the armor plates of glyptodonts, massive mammals resembling gigantic armadillos, with shells thick enough to deflect predators. Even birds could reach astonishing sizes. Some fossil remains described predators that stood over 2 meters tall, capable of running swiftly across open plains. Their beaks were shaped like hooked blades, built for hunting smaller animals that shared their environment. These discoveries transformed the way scientists understood Earth's past. The prehistoric world was not merely older than expected, it was filled with creatures of astonishing scale and diversity. Across continents, layers of rock revealed a consistent story. The giants were not rare anomalies. They had once been common inhabitants of the planet. Yet the deeper researchers looked, the stranger the record sometimes became. Certain fossils appeared briefly in early scientific reports, only to fade quietly from later discussion. In old journals and expedition notes, descriptions surfaced of unusually large bones that were difficult to classify at the time. Measurements were recorded. Illustrations were sometimes sketched. Then the trail simply ended. There are many possible reasons for this. Early paleontology was not the organized discipline it is today. Excavations were often chaotic, conducted by explorers or amateur collectors who lacked modern tools. Fossils could be damaged during transport or stored in collections that later disappeared. During wars, fires, or simple neglect, labels were sometimes lost, leaving specimens without clear records of where they were found. In other cases, bones that seemed unusual were eventually reclassified as belonging to known species once scientists had better comparative data. What first appeared mysterious might later fit comfortably within an established category. Still, the historical record contains gaps. Specimens mentioned once in old reports sometimes cannot be located today. Measurements recorded in early field notes occasionally describe bones larger than those commonly known from later collections. Whether these differences were caused by errors, exaggeration, or something else remains uncertain. Science does not rely on speculation, and careful researchers avoid drawing conclusions from incomplete evidence. Yet the imperfections of early exploration leave open a quiet possibility. What if some discoveries were simply misunderstood? What if certain fossils were collected at a time when scientists lacked the knowledge to interpret them properly? Across museums and archives, countless bones still wait inside drawers, wrapped in protective paper or stored in labeled trays. Many have already been studied in detail. Others have not been examined for decades. Each fossil is a fragment of a much larger story, and as those fragments accumulate, they continue to raise the same lingering question that began when the first giant bones were lifted from the earth. If these creatures once dominated the planet so completely, what force could have erased them from the living world so suddenly? For millions of years the giants endured. They walked through cycles of cold and warmth, through advancing glaciers and retreating ice. Entire landscapes shifted around them as the planet breathed through long climatic rhythms. Yet mammoths continued to roam the plains. Giant sloths still wandered through forests. Massive bison thundered across grasslands beneath skies that changed again and again. Then something changed. Near the end of the last ice age, beginning roughly 50,000 years ago in some regions and closer to 10,000 in others, a pattern began to appear in the fossil record. It did not arrive as a single moment carved sharply into time. Instead, it emerged gradually, like a fading echo across continents. The giants began to disappear. Layer by layer, the evidence reveals a quiet but unmistakable transformation. In North America, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and enormous short-faced bears vanish from the fossil record. In Australia, towering marsupials and giant kangaroos disappear. In South America, armored mammals that had walked the earth for millions of years suddenly fade from existence across the planet. Entire groups of large animals vanish within a relatively narrow window of geological time. Scientists call this event the late Pleistocene megafaunal extinction. At first, the explanation seems straightforward. The end of the Ice Age brought dramatic environmental change. Massive glaciers that once covered large parts of the northern hemisphere began to retreat. As ice melted, rivers shifted course and vast new lakes formed. Sea levels rose, flooding ancient coastlines that had once been dry land. Vegetation changed as temperatures warmed. Grasslands shrank in some regions, while forests expanded into new territory. Animals that had evolved for colder environments suddenly found themselves living in unfamiliar landscapes. Many researchers believed that these changes alone could explain the disappearance of the giants. Species adapted to one type of ecosystem may struggle when that ecosystem transforms rapidly. When habitats shift, food sources disappear, and populations decline. Yet another possibility appeared in the archaeological record. During this same period, humans were spreading across the planet. Small groups of hunter-gatherers expanded into new territories, carrying tools that had grown increasingly effective over generations. Stone spear points appear in sites across North America and Eurasia. In some places, these tools are found alongside the bones of megafauna, suggesting that early humans hunted animals far larger than themselves. This idea became known as the overkill hypothesis. According to this theory, even modest hunting pressure could slowly push large species toward extinction. Megafauna often reproduce slowly and require vast territories. If human hunters reduce their numbers year after year, populations might collapse over time. But the deeper researchers looked, the more complicated the story became. Some regions show evidence that megafauna vanished before humans arrive in significant numbers. In others, humans and giant animals appear to have lived alongside each other for thousands of years before extinction occurred. Climate alone cannot explain every disappearance. Human hunting alone cannot explain every pattern either. The fossil record reveals an extinction event that unfolded differently in different parts of the world. In some regions, the giants disappeared quickly. In others, they lingered for centuries or even millennia before fading away. The result is a mystery that remains unresolved. Something profound happened near the end of the Ice Age. A shift occurred that altered ecosystems across the entire planet. Whether driven by climate, human activity, or a complex interaction of many forces, the outcome was the same. The giants vanished. Today their bones remain scattered beneath layers of soil and sediment, silent witnesses to one of the most dramatic biological transitions in recent Earth history. And yet, as scientists continue to examine the evidence, another question quietly emerges. If the disappearance of the giants was so sudden and so widespread, is it possible that part of their story has not been fully preserved in the records we study today? Long before paleontology became a formal science, the discovery of ancient bones was often an accident. A farmer digging a well might strike something hard beneath the soil. A riverbank collapsing after heavy rain might reveal fragments of ivory or fossilized bone. Quarry workers breaking stone for construction sometimes uncovered shapes that did not resemble any animal they had ever seen. At first, these discoveries created more confusion than understanding. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, Europe and North America were filled with reports of enormous bones emerging from the earth. Newspapers occasionally printed curious stories about strange skeletons discovered beneath farmland. Travelers carried unusual specimens to cities where naturalists tried to identify them. Many people believed these bones belonged to giants. The idea seemed reasonable at the time. Ancient texts and folklore from many cultures described enormous beings that once walked the earth. When a bone larger than a human leg appeared in the soil, it was easy to imagine that it had belonged to such creatures. Others believed the remains belonged to mythical animals. The scientific tools needed to interpret these discoveries properly simply did not exist yet. Fossil classification was still in its infancy. The concept of extinction itself was controversial. Some scholars believed every creature ever created must still exist somewhere on the planet. As a result, early fossil discoveries were often interpreted through imagination rather than evidence. Large bones were displayed in traveling exhibitions where curious crowds gathered to see what promoters sometimes described as the remains of ancient monsters. In some cases, collectors attempted to reconstruct entire skeletons, using fragments from different animals, creating strange combinations that bore little resemblance to real prehistoric species. Yet, beneath the confusion, genuine discovery was taking place. Naturalists began comparing bones from different regions, gradually recognizing patterns. Large curved tusks appeared in multiple locations. Massive leg bones suggested animals far larger than any living species. Over time, scientists began to realize these fossils represented creatures that no longer existed. This realization changed everything. The discovery of extinct animals opened a new chapter in human understanding of the past. Earth was no longer seen as a static world where every species had always existed in its current form. Instead, it became clear that entire ecosystems had risen and vanished long before modern civilization. However, the early years of fossil discovery were anything but orderly. Excavations were rarely conducted with careful scientific methods. Bones were sometimes removed from the ground without detailed notes about their location or surrounding geology. Specimens passed through private collections, museums, and exhibitions without consistent documentation. Some fossils were lost in fires that destroyed early museums. Others disappeared when private collectors died, and their collections were scattered or sold. And occasionally, discoveries appeared briefly in written records only to vanish from discussion. Old scientific journals sometimes contain references to unusually large bones that were measured and described by early researchers. These accounts may mention discoveries made along riverbanks, inside caves, or during railway construction projects. The descriptions are often brief, written in the language of a time when scientists were still learning how to classify ancient life. But in some cases, those specimens are difficult to trace today. The bones may have been reclassified later under different names. They may have been misplaced within museum collections, or they may have been lost entirely during the chaotic early decades of paleontological exploration. The reasons are usually simple and human: limited knowledge, imperfect record keeping, and the challenges of studying a past that stretches far beyond written history. Yet the scattered references remain. In the margins of early reports and forgotten journals, there are hints of discoveries that puzzled the scientists who first encountered them. Measurements that seemed unusually large. Fragments that did not fit comfortably within known categories. Whether these accounts represent simple mistakes or overlooked evidence is difficult to determine now, but they leave behind a quiet possibility. If the earliest fossil discoveries were incomplete and chaotic, it raises a natural question that continues to echo through the study of ancient life. What happens to evidence that does not fit the expectations of the time in which it is discovered? Science often appears from the outside as a steady march toward certainty. Discoveries are announced, textbooks are updated, and the past seems to settle neatly into place. Yet the real process is quieter and far more uncertain. Knowledge grows through interpretation, and interpretation depends on the ideas that scientists carry with them at a particular moment in history. Evidence alone is enough. A bone pulled from ancient soil may contain the story of a species unknown to science. But until someone recognizes what that bone represents, it remains simply another specimen placed carefully in a drawer. Throughout the history of paleontology, there have been many moments when discoveries challenged what researchers expected to find. Sometimes the evidence was difficult to understand because the framework used to interpret it was incomplete. At other times, the discovery itself seemed so unusual that scientists hesitated to treat it as something entirely new. Instead, it was often easier to fit the bone into a category that already existed. This is not carelessness. It is a natural part of how human understanding develops. When faced with unfamiliar evidence, researchers compare it to what they already know. If a bone resembles part of a known animal, it may be classified within that species, even if subtle differences exist. Only later, when more examples appear, do those differences begin to stand out. Museum collections hold many such stories. In quiet storage rooms lined with shelves, thousands of fossils sit carefully catalogued and preserved. Some have been studied repeatedly for decades. Others were examined once when they arrived, and then placed aside while scientists focused on specimens that seemed easier to interpret. Occasionally, one of these forgotten pieces attracts attention again. A researcher reviewing old collections may notice a detail that earlier scientists overlooked, a tooth shape slightly different from any known species. a bone structure that suggests a larger or more powerful animal than previously imagined. With modern tools and comparative databases, even small variations can reveal something entirely unexpected. In several cases, entirely new species have been identified from fossils that sat unnoticed in museum drawers for generations. The bones were never hidden. They were simply waiting for someone to ask the right question. Technology has played an important role in this process. Modern imaging techniques allow scientists to examine fossils in ways that early researchers could never attempt. High-resolution scanning can reveal internal structures without damaging fragile specimens. Chemical analysis can provide clues about diet, habitat, and even ancient climates. With each new method, the past becomes slightly clearer. Yet these advancements also remind researchers how incomplete earlier interpretations may have been. A fossil that seemed ordinary a century ago might reveal surprising complexity when viewed with modern tools. Because of this, scientific knowledge rarely moves in a straight line. It evolves through revision, correction, and occasional rediscovery. A specimen misidentified in the past may become important again decades later. A fragment once dismissed as unremarkable may eventually help define an entirely new branch of evolutionary history. This process does not suggest that science ignores evidence. Instead, it reveals how understanding deepens gradually as information accumulates. Still, the possibility remains that some discoveries were never fully recognized for what they were. During the early years of fossil exploration, thousands of bones passed through private collections, exhibitions, and poorly documented excavations. Some specimens were catalogued carefully. Others were labeled with only minimal notes before being stored away across archives and museums. Many of these pieces still exist today. They rest quietly in cabinets, wrapped in protective paper, their labels sometimes written in faded ink from another century. And every so often, when a scientist opens one of those drawers, the past offers a small reminder that it may still hold more secrets than we realize. If overlooked discoveries can wait silently within museum collections for decades, it raises a compelling possibility. Perhaps some of the most important clues about Earth's lost giants are not buried underground at all, but already resting within the archives of the scientific world, waiting patiently to be seen with fresh eyes. For most of human history, the past was studied with little more than patience, careful observation, and a measuring tape. Scientists examined bones with magnifying lenses, compared shapes by hand, and recorded their conclusions in thick journals filled with sketches and handwritten notes. These early efforts built the foundation of paleontology, but they also left many questions unanswered. Today, the tools available to researchers have changed dramatically. Inside modern laboratories, fossils that once seemed silent are beginning to reveal new layers of information. Techniques that would have been unimaginable a century ago now allow scientists to study ancient remains with remarkable precision. Bones that once appeared ordinary can now be scanned, analyzed, and reconstructed in ways that bring the prehistoric world into sharper focus. One of the most powerful breakthroughs has been the study of ancient DNA. In certain rare conditions, fragments of genetic material survive inside fossilized remains. When researchers carefully extract and analyze this DNA, it becomes possible to trace the evolutionary relationships between extinct species and animals that still exist today. Mammoths, for example, are now known to share a close genetic connection with modern elephants. Through these molecular clues, scientists can reconstruct family trees that stretch deep into the past. Even when DNA does not survive, other forms of analysis can reveal surprising details. High-resolution scanning allows fossils to be examined without ever touching them. Using advanced imaging techniques, researchers can create detailed three-dimensional models of bones, revealing internal structures hidden within the fossil itself. Tiny growth patterns inside teeth can show how quickly an animal matured. Microfractures in bones can suggest how powerful its muscles once were. Chemical analysis offers another window into ancient life. Within the mineral structure of fossilized teeth and bones, scientists sometimes find chemical signatures that reveal what an animal ate and where it traveled. Isotope analysis can indicate whether an herbivore grazed on grasslands or browsed within forests. In some cases, it can even suggest how seasonal migrations shaped the movement of entire herds across prehistoric landscapes. With each new technique, the fossil record becomes more detailed. Specimens collected decades ago are being revisited with modern tools, and the results are occasionally surprising. Bones once thought to belong to familiar species sometimes turn out to represent entirely new animals. A fragment that appeared insignificant when it was first catalogued may reveal distinctive features that earlier scientists could not detect. This process has already rewritten parts of prehistoric history. In several museums, researchers examining old collections have identified species that had remained unrecognized for generations. The fossils were always there, carefully preserved and labeled, but their significance only became clear once new technologies made deeper analysis possible. The lesson is simple, but profound. The fossil record is not fixed. It grows richer each time a new method allows scientists to ask better questions. And beyond the walls of museums, the Earth still holds vast archives of ancient life. Beneath deserts, forests, and river valleys, layers of sediment preserve traces of ecosystems that vanished thousands of years ago. Many of these places have never been excavated. Others have barely been explored. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of the lost giants. Yet, even as the evidence grows clearer, the story remains incomplete. Every new fossil, every re-examined specimen, reminds researchers that the prehistoric world was more complex than early scientists imagined. Some of the most important clues may still lie buried beneath the ground. Others may already exist in museum collections, resting quietly on shelves where they have waited for decades. And somewhere, perhaps in a drawer that has not been opened for years, a fossil may be sitting unnoticed, holding a detail that could change the way we understand the giants who once ruled the Earth. Because although the animals themselves are gone, the search for their story is far from over, which leads to a deeper question beginning to emerge. If our tools are only now revealing how complex prehistoric life truly was, could it be possible that some of those ancient giants were even larger, or stranger, than modern science has yet recognized? When most people imagine the giants of the prehistoric world, a few familiar images appear almost immediately. Mammoths walking slowly across frozen plains, saber-toothed cats crouched in tall grass, massive bison with sweeping horns moving in dark herds across ancient grasslands. These animals already seem enormous by modern standards. Yet the deeper scientists look into the fossil record, the clearer something surprising becomes. Even these giants were not always the largest creatures of their time. In parts of South America, paleontologists uncovered the remains of ground sloths, so large that standing upright they could reach the height of a modern elephant. Their bodies were built like living fortresses of muscle and bone, supported by thick limbs that allowed them to rear up and pull branches from trees. When they moved through forests, they must have reshaped the landscape itself. Nearby lived creatures that resembled armadillos, though the comparison hardly captures their true scale. Glyptodonts carried enormous domed shells made of tightly interlocking armor plates. Some species grew as large as small cars, their heavy tails swinging behind them like blunt weapons. A predator approaching such an animal would have faced a wall of living armor across the northern plains. Bison once grew to astonishing sizes. Certain species carried horns that stretched more than 2 meters from tip to tip, wider than the outstretched arms of a human. Herds of these animals moving across grasslands would have resembled shifting landscapes rather than simple groups of animals. And then there were the birds. In several regions of the ancient world, enormous flightless birds evolved into dominant predators. Standing taller than a human and moving with startling speed, they hunted smaller animals across open terrain. Their powerful legs allowed them to run with relentless endurance, while hooked beaks delivered decisive strikes. To imagine such creatures sharing the same landscape requires a shift in perspective. The modern world feels vast to us, but the animals within it are comparatively modest. Elephants, the largest land animals alive today, seem extraordinary precisely because creatures of their scale are rare. In the prehistoric past, however, animals of similar or even greater size were far more common. Entire ecosystems revolved around giants. Grasslands stretched across continents, producing enormous amounts of vegetation capable of sustaining massive herbivores. These animals consumed huge quantities of plants each day, yet their movement across the land also helped maintain the ecosystems that supported them. Grazing prevented forests from spreading into open plains, while their migrations distributed nutrients and seeds over long distances. Predators evolved alongside them, growing powerful enough to hunt prey that weighed several tons. When scientists examine these ancient ecosystems, they begin to see a world built on abundance. The productivity of Ice Age landscapes allowed animals to grow larger, live longer, and shape their environments in ways that modern ecosystems rarely experience. Yet one detail continues to puzzle researchers. In many parts of the world, prehistoric animals were significantly larger than their modern descendants. The difference is not subtle. Species that once reached enormous sizes gradually became smaller over thousands of years. Why this happened remains an open question. Some scientists believe colder climates favored large bodies because they retain heat more effectively. Others suggest that expansive grasslands provided the steady food supply necessary to sustain massive herbivores. Evolutionary competition may also have played a role, encouraging animals to grow larger as a defense against predators or rivals. The truth may involve all of these factors working together. Still, the pattern remains striking. The deeper we look into the past, the larger many animals appear to become. It leads to a quiet reflection. If Earth once supported creatures of such immense scale, if ecosystems once thrived beneath the footsteps of animals that dwarfed most modern wildlife, then something fundamental about the planet must have changed. Because when we look around today, the world feels smaller. The giants that once shaped entire landscapes are gone, and the ecosystems they helped maintain have shifted into new forms. Which raises an important question that scientists must answer carefully. When paleontologists uncover a few scattered bones buried beneath ancient sediment, how do they determine the true size and shape of animals that disappeared tens of thousands, or even millions? When people imagine the discovery of prehistoric animals, they often picture a perfect skeleton emerging from the ground, bones neatly arranged exactly as the creature once stood in life. The reality is rarely so simple. More often, the story begins with something far less complete. A single bone, perhaps a tooth, buried in ancient sediment. A fragment of a jaw revealed by erosion along a riverbank. Sometimes an entire excavation yields only scattered pieces, broken and separated by thousands of years of geological change. Time, pressure, and shifting landscapes rarely preserve animals exactly as they died. Yet from these fragments, scientists attempt something extraordinary. They attempt to rebuild entire worlds. The work of paleontology often resembles a quiet form of detective work. Each fossil becomes a clue, and every clue must be interpreted carefully. A femur can reveal how much weight an animal once carried. The curvature of a rib suggests the size of the chest that surrounded it. Even the shape of a tooth may reveal what the creature ate and how it survived within its ecosystem. Piece by piece, the fragments begin to form a pattern. One of the most important tools researchers use is comparative anatomy. By examining the structure of bones and comparing them with those of living animals, scientists can estimate how an extinct creature might have moved. The joints of a limb reveal how far it could bend. The attachment points of muscles show where strength and motion once existed. A single bone can carry surprising amounts of information. Consider the discovery of a massive leg bone belonging to an unknown prehistoric animal. By comparing that bone with similar bones from modern species, scientists can estimate the size of the muscles that once surrounded it. Those estimates lead to calculations about weight and balance. Gradually, the skeleton begins to take shape. Today, digital modeling has expanded these methods even further. High-resolution scans allow researchers to create detailed three-dimensional images of fossils. Using computer simulations, scientists can explore how joints moved and how muscles might have attached to bone. Entire animals can be reconstructed digitally, allowing researchers to test how they might have walked, run, or hunted. These models transform fragments into living motion. But the process is not always precise. Early reconstructions of prehistoric animals sometimes reflected the limited knowledge available at the time. In the 19th century, For example, some dinosaurs were imagined as slow, tail-dragging reptiles, because scientists believed their bodies could not support an upright posture. Later discoveries revealed that many of these animals actually stood tall and moved with surprising agility. The bones had always contained the truth. It simply took time to interpret them correctly. Even small details can change the picture dramatically. A slight misinterpretation of a joint angle might make an animal appear heavier or slower than it really was. A missing bone can lead researchers to estimate proportions that later discoveries may correct. Because of this, the prehistoric world is constantly being revised. Each new fossil adds another piece to the puzzle, and each piece can reshape earlier conclusions. Sometimes a single discovery forces scientists to rethink an entire species. The past, it seems, is not fixed. It is assembled slowly, fragment by fragment, as new evidence emerges from the ground. This careful process has allowed researchers to reconstruct creatures that disappeared tens of thousands or even millions of years ago. Yet the work remains incomplete because every reconstruction begins with interpretation, and occasionally fossils appear that do not fit easily into the patterns scientists expect to see. When that happens, the mystery deepens, and the fragments may begin to hint at something the prehistoric world has not yet fully revealed. Most fossil discoveries fit into patterns that scientists gradually learn to recognize. A tooth matches a known species. A fragment of bone resembles the limb of an animal already documented in earlier excavations. Over time, these patterns allow researchers to map entire ecosystems that existed long before humans began recording history. But every so often, a fossil appears that refuses to follow those patterns. At first, the difference may seem small, a bone that appears slightly larger than expected, a joint structure that does not align perfectly with known species. Sometimes the unusual feature is subtle enough that it can be explained away as natural variation within a population. Other times, the differences are more difficult to ignore. Throughout the history of paleontology, researchers have occasionally encountered fossils that did not fit comfortably within existing classifications. Some specimens appeared to belong to animals far larger than any known member of their group. Others displayed anatomical traits that seemed to blend features from different species in unexpected ways. These discoveries do not always lead immediately to new conclusions. Science moves cautiously, especially when evidence challenges established understanding. Before declaring the existence of a new species, researchers must carefully compare the fossil to known specimens, examine its geological context, and rule out the possibility that the differences result from damage, distortion, or incomplete preservation. Sometimes, the explanation is simple. A bone that appears unusually large might belong to an older individual that lived longer than most of its species. A feature that seems unfamiliar may turn out to be a normal part of the skeleton once additional fossils are discovered. But occasionally the investigation leads somewhere more surprising. Entire species have been identified only after scientists revisited fossils that had been sitting quietly in museum collections for decades. When early researchers first encountered those bones, they lacked the comparative material necessary to recognize what they were seeing. The fossils were catalogued carefully, but interpreted within the limits of existing knowledge. Years later, when additional discoveries appeared, the pattern finally became clear. What once seemed like an odd specimen was actually evidence of an entirely different animal. This process has repeated itself many times throughout the study of prehistoric life. New species are not always discovered in the field. Sometimes they are discovered in archives, when a researcher notices a small detail that earlier scientists could not fully interpret. The fossil record, in this sense, behaves less like a finished book and more like an unfinished manuscript. Each generation of scientists reads the same evidence with new tools and new perspectives. A fragment of bone examined a century ago may reveal additional information when studied with modern techniques. Subtle differences that once seemed insignificant can become important clues. And with each new discovery, the prehistoric world grows slightly more complex. It becomes clear that ancient ecosystems were not simple collections of familiar animals. They were dynamic systems filled with species that interacted in ways we are only beginning to understand. Some were larger than expected. Others evolved unusual adaptations that challenge assumptions about how ancient animals lived and moved. Occasionally, these discoveries lead researchers to reconsider fossils that were previously dismissed or misunderstood. This does not suggest that scientists intentionally ignored unusual evidence. Rather, it reflects the slow and careful nature of scientific progress. Knowledge advances through refinement, through the gradual correction of earlier interpretations as new information becomes available. Still, the possibility remains that some discoveries were simply ahead of their time. A bone uncovered during the early years of fossil exploration might have been measured, described, and stored away before researchers possessed the context needed to recognize its significance. Without additional examples to compare, the fossil may have remained an isolated curiosity. Only later, as new specimens emerge, does the true picture begin to take shape. The deeper scientists explore the past, the more they realize how much remains unknown. Ancient ecosystems were richer and more diverse than earlier generations imagined. The giants of prehistory were not a single group of animals, but part of a vast and complex network of life. And as the fossil record slowly expands, it becomes increasingly clear that our understanding of that world is still evolving, which leads to a larger mystery that extends beyond individual discoveries. If prehistoric ecosystems were filled with giants, whose remains are only now being fully understood, it raises an even more profound question. Why did so many of these enormous creatures disappear during the same brief chapter of Earth's history? For thousands of years, the Ice Age world moved to a rhythm that seemed almost eternal. Winters were long and cold. Glaciers stretched across the northern continents, and enormous animals followed ancient migration paths across plains that had existed for generations beyond counting. The giants of that world had already survived countless shifts in climate. Ice had advanced and retreated before. Forests had grown and vanished. Rivers had changed their courses again and again, yet the animals endured. Then, near the end of the last ice age, the pace of change began to accelerate. Across the northern hemisphere, immense glaciers that once covered large parts of North America and Eurasia slowly began to melt. Walls of ice, thousands of meters thick, withdrew toward the poles. As they retreated, the landscapes beneath them emerged for the first time in thousands of years. New rivers formed where meltwater carved channels through ancient valleys. Vast lakes appeared behind natural ice dams, sometimes growing to sizes larger than modern seas, before suddenly draining away in enormous floods. Coastlines shifted as rising oceans swallowed lowlands that had once connected continents. The world that megafauna had known for millennia began to transform. Grasslands that had once stretched across wide regions gradually changed. In some places, forests expanded northward as temperatures warmed. In others, new wetlands formed where glaciers had left behind shallow basins filled with meltwater. Entire ecosystems reorganized themselves as plants and animals, adjusted to the changing climate. Scientists studying these ancient transitions often turn to the quiet language of geology. Layer by layer, sediment preserves a record of the past. Pollen grains trapped in soil reveal what plants once grew in a region. Tiny fragments of charcoal record ancient wildfires. Fossilized bones mark the presence of animals that once moved through those landscapes. When researchers began examining these layers in detail, they noticed something remarkable. Across many parts of the world, the bones of megafauna gradually disappeared from the record, around the same general period, near the end of the Ice Age. Mammoths that had walked across frozen plains for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly became rare. Giant ground sloths vanished from forests where their ancestors had lived for millions of years. Massive bison, saber-toothed cats, and enormous short-faced bears faded from the fossil record as well. It was not a single event that happened everywhere at once. In some regions, certain species disappeared earlier than others. In other areas, pockets of megafauna survived longer than expected. A few isolated populations lingered for centuries after their relatives had vanished elsewhere. Yet the overall pattern was unmistakable. Within a relatively brief span of geological time, only a few thousand years in many places, an entire community of large animals disappeared from ecosystems across multiple continents. For creatures that had ruled their environments for millions of years, the change was astonishingly sudden. The fossil record captures this moment as a quiet turning point. Above certain sediment layers, the bones of giant animals become increasingly rare, then vanish entirely, Smaller animals remain. Plants continue to evolve, but the enormous herbivores and predators that once shaped those landscapes are gone. The Earth itself did not stop changing. Rivers continue to flow, forests continue to grow, and new species gradually filled the ecological spaces left behind. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The age of giants, which had defined ecosystems for so long, had come to an end. What makes this moment so fascinating is not only the scale of the disappearance, but its uneven pattern. Some species vanished quickly, others lingered longer in scattered regions. A few seemed to survive against the odds before finally fading away. These differences suggest that the extinction of megafauna was not caused by a single, simple event. Instead, it appears to have been the result of multiple forces interacting across changing landscapes. Climate shifts, evolving ecosystems, and the growing presence of humans may all have played roles in ways scientists are still trying to understand. The deeper researchers examine the evidence, the more complex the story becomes. And so, the search for answers continues, as scientists attempt to unravel one of the most dramatic turning points in the recent history of life on Earth. As scientists began searching for explanations behind the disappearance of the Ice Age giants, one possibility stood out with striking clarity. Around the same time, many megafaunal species began to vanish. A new presence was spreading across the planet. Humans. For hundreds of thousands of years, small groups of early humans had lived across parts of Africa and Eurasia. Over time, they developed sharper tools, improved hunting strategies, and the ability to adapt to a wide range of environments. Eventually, these communities began moving into territories that had never before been occupied by human hunters. They crossed frozen land bridges, followed river systems into new continents, and gradually expanded into ecosystems already inhabited by enormous animals. At first glance, the timing seemed difficult to ignore. In several regions of the world, the arrival of humans appears to align closely with the disappearance of large animals. This observation gave rise to what scientists call the overkill hypothesis. According to this theory, early humans hunted megafauna so effectively that populations of these massive creatures gradually collapsed. The logic behind the idea is not difficult to understand. Large animals tend to reproduce slowly. A mammoth might carry a single calf after a long pregnancy, and then spend years raising it before another could be born. Populations built through such slow cycles can remain stable for long periods, but they are also vulnerable. Even small increases in mortality can push them toward decline. If human hunters removed animals from these populations faster than they could reproduce, the consequences might unfold gradually, but inevitably. Archaeological evidence offers some support for this possibility. At certain excavation sites, the bones of megafauna have been discovered alongside stone spear points and other hunting tools. In a few cases, scientists have even identified marks on fossilized bones that appear to come from stone blades used during butchering. These clues suggest that humans did hunt some of the largest animals of the Ice Age. Imagining those encounters is remarkable in itself. Small groups of hunters facing creatures that weighed several tons would have needed coordination, patience, and skill. They likely relied on strategy rather than strength, using terrain, traps, and teamwork to bring down animals that towered above them. Such hunts may have provided enormous rewards. A single mammoth could feed a community for weeks and provide hides, bones, and fat that supported survival through harsh winters. Over time, however, repeated hunting could have placed increasing pressure on already fragile populations. Yet, as compelling as this explanation may seem, the evidence does not always align neatly with the theory. In other places, humans and giant animals appear to have lived side by side for thousands of years without immediate extinction. These patterns complicate the picture. If human hunting alone caused the disappearance of megafauna, the timing of extinctions would likely follow a more consistent pattern across different continents. Instead, the fossil record shows a patchwork of events unfolding differently in different environments. This does not mean that humans played no role. Many scientists believe human activity likely contributed to the pressure faced by large animals, particularly species already struggling to adapt to changing conditions. Hunting, habitat disruption, and competition for resources may all have influenced vulnerable populations. But the story appears to be more complex than a single cause. The Ice Age world was already undergoing dramatic environmental shifts. Temperatures were rising, glaciers were retreating, and ecosystems were reorganizing themselves across vast landscapes. Against that backdrop of planetary change, the arrival of humans may have added another layer of pressure to an already unstable system. Which leads to a larger question. If human hunters alone cannot fully explain the disappearance of the giants, perhaps the answer lies in something even more powerful than human activity, something rooted in the changing rhythms of the Earth itself. Long before humans began recording history, the Earth was already capable of sudden and dramatic change. The end of the last Ice Age was not a slow, gentle warming that unfolded smoothly across thousands of years. Instead, evidence preserved deep within glaciers and ancient sediments tells a far more turbulent story. The climate system during this period behaved unpredictably, shifting in ways that would have transformed entire ecosystems within the span of a human lifetime. Scientists studying ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica have discovered that temperatures sometimes rose or fell with startling speed. In some cases, dramatic shifts occurred within only a few decades. To animals adapted to a stable environment, such changes could alter the balance of survival almost overnight. A grassland might slowly give way to expanding forests. A wetland might dry out and become open plain. Migration routes that animals had followed for generations could vanish as rivers changed course or new barriers appeared across the landscape. The world of the giants was becoming unstable. As glaciers retreated, enormous volumes of meltwater reshaped the continents. Vast lakes formed behind walls of ice, sometimes growing for centuries before suddenly bursting through their natural dams. When those floods occurred, they unleashed torrents powerful enough to carve new valleys and carry entire forests downstream. These dramatic events did not happen everywhere at once, but they created a world filled with environmental uncertainty. Plants shifted their ranges as temperatures warmed. Some species thrived under the new conditions, spreading rapidly into newly available territory. Others struggled to survive as the habitats they depended on disappeared. Large animals, particularly megafauna, were especially vulnerable to such changes. Creatures that require enormous amounts of food and space depend on stable ecosystems. When vegetation patterns shift and water sources move, the delicate balance that sustains large populations can begin to collapse. Some researchers believe these environmental pressures alone could have pushed many species toward extinction. But the story may be even more complicated. In recent decades, scientists examining sediment layers from the end of the Ice Age have identified unusual patterns that suggest the possibility of sudden, catastrophic events. Tiny fragments of minerals and unusual chemical signatures appear in certain geological layers dating to roughly the same period when many megafauna disappeared. A few researchers have proposed that fragments of a comet or asteroid may have entered Earth's atmosphere during this time, potentially triggering widespread environmental disruption. According to this idea, atmospheric disturbances or regional impacts could have ignited massive wildfires, altered climate patterns, or disrupted ecosystems already under stress. The hypothesis remains controversial. Many scientists continue to debate whether the evidence truly supports the idea of a cosmic event. Some believe the geological signatures can be explained by natural processes already occurring during the climate transition. Others argue that further research may yet reveal a more dramatic episode hidden within the sediment record. What these debates reveal is not certainty, but complexity. The disappearance of the Ice Age giants may not have been caused by a single force, acting alone. Instead, it may have emerged from the interaction of several pressures unfolding at the same time. Climate instability reshaping ecosystems, human hunters expanding into new territories, environmental disruptions altering landscapes that had remained stable for thousands of years. Together, these forces could have created a fragile moment in Earth's history when species that had survived for millions of years suddenly faced challenges they could not overcome. The giants did not vanish because of one simple event. They disappeared during a convergence of changes that reshaped the planet itself. And yet, even as the fossil record reveals this dramatic turning point, another possibility quietly emerges from the evidence. If the extinction of megafauna unfolded differently across regions and species, it raises a question that scientists are still exploring today. Could some of those ancient giants have survived longer than we once believed, leaving traces that are only now beginning to surface from the layers of time? When scientists first began mapping the disappearance of the Ice Age giants, the story appeared straightforward. Fossil layers suggested that most megafauna vanished near the end of the last glacial period, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. The pattern seemed clear enough to form a simple narrative. The Ice Age ended, the climate changed, humans spread across continents, and the giants disappeared. Yet the deeper researchers looked into the fossil record. The more that tidy timeline began to blur. Extinction, it turns out, rarely unfolds as a single moment. Instead, it behaves more like a fading echo that weakens gradually across landscapes. Some species vanish quickly in one region, while surviving much longer in another. Populations that disappear from large continents sometimes linger quietly in remote corners of the world. One of the most striking examples comes from a windswept island in the Arctic Ocean known as Wrangel Island. For many years, scientists believed that mammoths vanished entirely around 10,000 years ago. Their bones seemed to disappear from mainland fossil deposits after that point. But when researchers began examining remains discovered on this isolated island, north of Siberia, the results were unexpected. Radiocarbon dating revealed that mammoths survived there thousands of years longer. While their mainland relatives had already disappeared, a small population continued to live on Wrangel Island until roughly 4,000 years ago. At that time, the pyramids of Egypt were already rising beside the Nile, and human civilizations were taking shape in many parts of the world. Yet far to the north, mammoths still walked across frozen tundra. Isolation had protected them. Rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age eventually separated Wrangel Island from the mainland, creating a refuge where mammoths survived beyond the Great Extinction that had already reshaped most ecosystems. This discovery forced scientists to reconsider how extinction unfolds. Instead of a single dramatic disappearance, the evidence suggested something more uneven. Populations shrink, fragment, and retreat into isolated habitats, where they persist for centuries or even millennia before finally fading away. Similar patterns appear in other species as well. In some regions, giant ground sloths and other megafauna lingered longer than expected, based on earlier fossil interpretations. As new discoveries appear and dating techniques improve, timelines occasionally shift by hundreds or even thousands of years. The key to understanding these patterns lies in a method known as radiocarbon dating. This technique measures the gradual decay of carbon isotopes inside organic material. Because all living organisms absorb carbon during their lifetimes, the amount remaining after death can reveal how long ago the organism lived. By carefully measuring these isotopes, scientists can estimate the age of bones, wood, and other ancient materials. The method is powerful, but it is not perfect. Environmental contamination can sometimes alter samples. Fossils may absorb carbon from surrounding soil or groundwater, creating small inaccuracies in the results. In other cases, only tiny fragments of bone remain available for testing, making precise measurements difficult. As a result, timelines are occasionally revised as new samples are analyzed. These revisions reveal an important truth about extinction events. They do not occur everywhere at once. Instead, they ripple across landscapes, unfolding at different speeds, depending on geography, climate, and the resilience of local populations. A species may vanish from one region while quietly surviving in another. This realization opens the door to a subtle but fascinating possibility. If mammoths could survive thousands of years longer than scientists once believed, protected by the isolation of a remote island, then perhaps other megafauna populations also endured beyond their expected extinction dates. Small groups could have persisted in valleys, forests, or islands that left little trace in the fossil record. In the vastness of prehistoric landscapes, it is not impossible that a few survivors lingered longer than anyone realized. Which raises an intriguing question. How often do scientists discover that animals believed to be extinct had actually survived far longer than history first suggested? The fossil record often gives the impression that extinction is final. A species appears in ancient layers of rock, persists for thousands or millions of years and then disappears. Once its bones vanish from the geological timeline, the assumption seems simple: the creature is gone forever. Yet history has occasionally delivered surprises. Scientists have a name for a peculiar phenomenon in which a species seems to vanish from the fossil record for an immense span of time, only to reappear unexpectedly in the living world. These organisms are sometimes called Lazarus species, named after the biblical story of something returning after being presumed lost. The idea sounds almost mythical at first, but in reality it has happened more than once. One of the most famous examples emerged in the waters off the coast of South Africa in 1938. For decades, paleontologists had studied fossils of an ancient fish known as the coelacanth. Its bones appeared in rock layers more than 400 million years old and seemed to disappear from the fossil record. About 66 million years ago, around the same time, dinosaurs vanished. The conclusion seemed obvious. The coelacanth had gone extinct, with many other ancient species. Then, one winter morning, a fishing trawler hauled something unusual from the deep ocean. Among the catch was a strange fish with thick, fleshy fins and a body shape that looked uncannily familiar to scientists who studied fossils. It was a living coelacanth. An animal believed extinct for tens of millions of years had been swimming quietly in the deep sea the entire time. Later discoveries revealed that small populations of these fish still existed in isolated underwater caves in parts of the Indian Ocean. The fossil record had not been wrong exactly. It had simply been incomplete. Other rediscoveries followed. Plants thought to have vanished centuries ago have been found growing in remote valleys. Insects known only from fossilized impressions have reappeared in isolated forests. Small reptiles and amphibians once declared extinct have been rediscovered during biological surveys in regions rarely visited by scientists. These moments remind researchers of something important. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Many species live in environments that humans rarely explore. Dense tropical forests, high mountain ranges, deep ocean trenches, and isolated islands all contain ecosystems that remain only partially studied. Within these hidden corners of the planet, small populations of animals can persist quietly for long periods without attracting attention. In such places, survival can go unnoticed. Most Lazarus species share a common trait. They tend to be small or live in habitats where observation is difficult. Tiny amphibians living in remote wetlands, insects hidden in dense vegetation, or deep-sea fish dwelling far below sunlight can easily remain unseen for generations. Large animals are far more difficult to conceal. For this reason, scientists do not suggest that mammoths or giant ground sloths might still roam the modern world undetected. Creatures of that size leave unmistakable traces in the environment. Their footprints, feeding patterns, and remains would almost certainly have been discovered. Yet, the Lazarus phenomenon does reveal something profound about the limits of the fossil record. The geological timeline is built from fragments. Bones preserved in sediment represent only a small portion of the creatures that once lived. Entire populations can exist without leaving fossils behind, and species may survive long after their last known remains appear in the record. In other words, extinction dates are sometimes estimates, rather than exact moments. The rediscovery of living species once believed lost reminds scientists to approach ancient history with humility. Each fossil layer offers a glimpse of the past, but it rarely tells the entire story. Some chapters remain hidden, and occasionally those hidden chapters reappear when least expected, revealing that life has a remarkable ability to persist in places where no one thought to look, which leads to an even more intriguing thought: if extinction timelines can be incomplete, could the echoes of ancient animals sometimes survive not only in fossils, but in the memories and stories of the humans who once shared the world with them? Long before written history, before ink met paper, or stone tablets recorded the events of kingdoms, humans relied on memory. Stories passed from one voice to another across generations, carried beside campfires across deserts, along rivers, and through forests. These stories were not simply entertainment. They were ways of preserving knowledge about landscapes, animals, and events that shaped the lives of entire communities. Sometimes those stories lasted far longer. Across many cultures, Ancient traditions speak of enormous animals that once roamed the land. Some are described as towering beasts with great strength. Others appear in tales as powerful creatures moving through forests, grasslands, or river valleys. In many cases, the stories are wrapped in symbolism or myth, yet the scale of the animals described often feels strikingly familiar. Modern listeners might interpret these creatures as purely legendary. Yet when researchers began comparing some of these traditions with paleontological discoveries, an intriguing possibility emerged. Perhaps a few of these stories were not inventions at all. In Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions have been passed down for tens of thousands of years. Some stories describe enormous animals that lived in the distant past. Creatures larger than modern kangaroos, or wombats, that once walked across the continent. When scientists compare these descriptions with fossils of extinct marsupials, such as giant kangaroos and diprotodons, the similarities sometimes seem difficult to ignore. Diprotodons were among the largest marsupials that ever lived, animals that resembled enormous wombats the size of rhinoceroses. They disappeared thousands of years ago, yet fossils confirm that early humans in Australia would have lived alongside them. It is possible that memories of those encounters survived within the older stories. Similar echoes appear in other parts of the world. In North America, some indigenous traditions describe enormous beasts that once roamed the plains long ago, creatures larger than any animals seen today. These stories often speak of a time when the land was different and great animals moved across open landscapes before gradually fading from the world. Researchers who study oral history approach these accounts carefully. Myths and legends are not the same as scientific evidence. Stories evolve over time as they pass from one generation to another. Details shift, symbolism grows, and elements of imagination can become intertwined with fragments of real events. Yet, oral traditions have sometimes proven surprisingly accurate in preserving environmental knowledge. In Australia, certain indigenous stories describing rising seas appear to correspond with geological evidence of coastline flooding that occurred more than 7,000 years ago. These accounts suggest that human memory, when carried through storytelling traditions, can preserve traces of real events across remarkable spans of time. If landscapes and floods can remain in cultural memory for thousands of years, the possibility arises that encounters with ancient animals might also leave faint impressions in oral traditions. Of course, such connections are difficult to prove with certainty. Stories rarely contain the precise details needed for scientific verification. They exist within cultural frameworks that transform historical experiences into meaningful narratives. Yet the idea remains quietly compelling. Early humans lived alongside many species of megafauna. They saw these giants moving across the land, watched them graze, migrate, and sometimes disappear. For communities deeply connected to their environment, such encounters would have left powerful impressions. It would not be surprising if fragments of those experiences found their way into stories shared across generations. In this sense, human memory may function in a way similar to the fossil record. Neither preserves the past perfectly. Both capture fragments, pieces of reality shaped by time and interpretation, but within those fragments, hints of ancient worlds can sometimes remain. Bones buried in sediment tell part of the story of the giants. Stories whispered through generations may carry another kind of evidence, softer, but still meaningful. Together they remind us that the prehistoric world was not entirely silent. Humans were there to witness its final chapters, and if ancient memory holds even the faintest echoes of those encounters, it raises a deeper question about the world those giants once inhabited. What kind of planet could sustain animals so immense that their presence still lingers in fossils, landscapes, and perhaps even in the oldest stories humanity remembers? To understand the giants of the prehistoric world, it is not enough to study the animals themselves. One must also imagine the landscapes that allowed such creatures to exist. Enormous animals cannot survive in fragile environments. Their bodies require immense amounts of food, water, for mammoths, giant bison, and ground sloths to thrive. The ecosystems around them had to produce energy on a remarkable scale. During the Ice Age, much of the northern hemisphere was covered by a vast and unusual environment that scientists now call the Mammoth Steppe. This was not a frozen wasteland, as it is sometimes imagined. Instead, it was a rich mosaic of grasslands, flowering plants, shrubs, and hardy vegetation stretching across enormous distances from Western Europe through Siberia and into North America. The cold climate actually helped preserve these grasslands. Lower temperatures slowed the growth of dense forests, allowing grasses and herbaceous plants to dominate the landscape. In summer months, these plants grew quickly under long northern daylight, creating fields of vegetation capable of feeding herds of massive animals. Across these plains moved mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant bison, and wild horses. Their grazing kept the vegetation short and open, preventing trees from spreading too quickly across the landscape. In doing so, they maintained the very environment that sustained them. These giants were not simply inhabitants of the ecosystem, they were engineers of it. As herds moved across the land, they trampled soil, redistributed seeds, and fertilized the ground through their waste. Each migration helped shape the pattern of plant growth across the plains. Where mammoths pushed over small trees or cleared paths through brush, grasslands remained open and productive. Predators followed these movements closely. Saber-toothed cats, wolves, and other hunters depended on the presence of large herbivores. Their survival required the same balance that sustained the grazing animals. If the herds were healthy, predators thrived. If the herds declined, the predators would soon struggle as well. In this way, Ice Age ecosystems operated as tightly connected networks. Every species influenced the landscape around it. The giants stood at the center of that balance, their movements shaping the structure of entire regions. When scientists reconstruct these ancient environments, they begin to see how different the planet once looked. Large areas that are now forested may once have been open grasslands, maintained by grazing animals. Plains that appear quiet today might once have echoed with the movement of enormous herds migrating across vast distances. In recent decades, researchers have begun exploring an intriguing idea. The disappearance of megafauna may have transformed ecosystems far more dramatically than previously believed. Without large herbivores constantly grazing vegetation, grasslands in many regions slowly gave way to expanding forests. Plants that once remained under control began spreading into new areas. Over centuries, entire landscapes shifted as ecological balances changed. Some scientists now suggest that many modern ecosystems may actually be the long-term result of losing these giant animals. In other words, the environments we consider natural today may represent a world already altered by extinction. Forests that feel ancient may have expanded only after megafauna vanished. Grasslands that seem stable may once have been far more extensive when maintained by roaming herds of giant herbivores. This realization adds a new dimension to the story of the Ice Age giants. Their disappearance did not simply remove a few impressive species from the planet. It may have reshaped ecosystems across continents, altering the landscapes that humans eventually came to know as the natural world. And once that possibility begins to take shape, another question quietly follows. Did environmental changes destroy the giants first? Or did the loss of the giants transform the environment itself? When a single species disappears from an ecosystem, the change may seem small at first. One animal vanishes, another continues living, and the landscape appears much the same, but ecosystems rarely operate in isolation. Every species influences others in ways that are not always obvious. Remove one piece of the system, and the effects can travel outward in quiet but powerful waves. Ecologists call this process a feedback loop. In a feedback loop, one change triggers another, which then reinforces the original shift. The process can continue for decades or centuries, gradually transforming entire landscapes long after the first disturbance occurred. The disappearance of megafauna may have triggered one of the largest ecological feedback loops in recent Earth history. When mammoths, giant bison, and other large herbivores roamed across Ice Age grasslands, they consumed enormous quantities of vegetation. Their grazing kept grasses short and prevented shrubs and trees from taking over open plains. As they moved across the land, they trampled young saplings and disturbed the soil, giving grasses and flowering plants room to grow. These animals were constantly reshaping the environment simply by feeding and traveling. When the giants began to disappear, that influence faded. Without vast herds of grazers to control plant growth, vegetation patterns began to change. Grasses that had once been kept low grew taller and thicker. Shrubs expanded into areas that had previously been maintained as open plains. Over time, forests slowly spread into landscapes where grasslands had once dominated. The shift may have seemed gradual, but its effects were far-reaching. As plant communities changed, the animals that depended on those plants also faced new conditions. Some species adapted easily to expanding forests. Others, particularly animals specialized for open grasslands, began to decline. Predators that once hunted large herbivores also struggled to adjust. Without mammoths, giant bison, and other large prey, the balance between hunter and hunted changed across entire ecosystems. Even the patterns of fire may have been influenced by the loss of megafauna. Some researchers believe large herbivores helped regulate the amount of plant material accumulating on the landscape. By constantly grazing, they removed vegetation that might otherwise dry out and become fuel for wildfires. Their movement also broke up plant cover, creating natural barriers that slowed the spread of flames. When these animals vanished, vegetation began to accumulate more densely. Over time, this buildup of plant material may have increased both the frequency and intensity of wildfires in certain regions. Fires that once moved slowly across open grasslands could now burn hotter and spread more easily through dense vegetation. The ecosystem began to respond to its own transformation. Forests, altered rainfall patterns, and soil composition. Changes in fire frequency influenced which plant species could survive. As each shift unfolded, it reinforced others already underway, pushing the environment further away from the conditions that once supported megafauna. This is the quiet power of ecological feedback. An extinction event rarely ends with the disappearance of a single species. Instead, it ripples outward, reshaping relationships between plants, animals, and landscapes in ways that can last for thousands of years. The loss of the giants may have set in motion a chain reaction that continues to shape the planet even today. Grasslands became forests. Predator populations changed. Fire patterns evolved. Entire ecological networks reorganized themselves in response to the absence of animals that once dominated their environments. In this sense, the extinction of megafauna was not simply the end of a few impressive species. It may have been the beginning of a new ecological era, and once this possibility comes into view, it invites a deeper and more mysterious question. If the disappearance of the giants reshaped the Earth so dramatically, what conditions existed during the Ice Age that allowed such enormous animals to evolve and thrive in the first place? The Ice Age world did not merely contain giants by coincidence. The presence of enormous animals across multiple continents suggests that something about that ancient environment favored size in a way that the modern world rarely does. When scientists examine fossils from the Pleistocene epoch, they notice a pattern that appears again and again. Many species were far larger than their closest living relatives today. The question is simple, but the answer is not. Why did so many animals grow so large? One explanation begins with the climate itself. During the Ice Age, much of the planet experienced colder temperatures than today. In colder environments, large bodies provide an advantage. Bigger animals lose heat more slowly than smaller ones, allowing them to conserve energy in harsh climates. This pattern, known to biologists as Bergmann's rule, can be observed in many living species even today. Animals living in colder regions often grow larger than those in warmer environments. For megafauna, this advantage may have been significant. A massive body helped mammoths endure freezing winds across open tundra. Thick layers of fat and dense fur insulated them against temperatures that smaller animals might struggle to survive. Size in this context was not simply impressive, it was practical. Yet climate alone cannot explain the abundance of giants during the Ice Age. The structure of ancient ecosystems likely played an equally important role. Vast grasslands covered large portions of the northern continents, forming ecosystems capable of producing enormous amounts of plant material each growing season. These landscapes could support immense herds of herbivores grazing across the plains. Where food is abundant and territory is wide, animals have the opportunity to grow larger over many generations. The presence of predators may have also influenced this process. Larger animals often enjoy advantages in defense. A towering herbivore is more difficult for predators to attack successfully, and thick bones or armor can discourage even powerful hunters. Over time, natural selection may favor individuals capable of growing larger and stronger. Competition between species may reinforce this trend. When multiple animals compete for similar food sources, size can determine who gains access to the best resources. A larger animal can travel farther, reach higher vegetation, or defend feeding territory more effectively. Across thousands of generations, these small advantages can slowly reshape the average size of a species. The Ice Age world, with its wide grasslands and powerful predators, may have created conditions where growing larger became a successful evolutionary strategy. But evolution rarely moves in only one direction. When ecosystems experience sudden disruption, the pattern often reverses. As environments become less stable, smaller animals tend to survive more easily. They require less food, reproduce more quickly, and adapt more rapidly to changing conditions. Over long periods of time, this shift can lead to a phenomenon scientists sometimes call dwarfing. Species that once grew to enormous sizes gradually become smaller. Their descendants evolve into forms better suited to landscapes where resources are less predictable or where large body size no longer provides the same advantage. In many cases, the animals we see today may represent these smaller descendants. Modern bison, for example, are significantly smaller than some of their prehistoric relatives. Elephants remain large, but they are among the few survivors of a once diverse group of giant proboscideans that included mammoths and mastodons. The Ice Age world supported giants because its conditions rewarded them. But when those conditions changed, the giants disappeared, leaving behind a quieter landscape shaped by different evolutionary pressures. Seen this way, the megafauna of the past were not strange anomalies or evolutionary accidents. They were creatures perfectly adapted to the environments that produced them. Their disappearance did not simply remove large animals from the planet. It marked the end of an entire ecological era. And once that era ended, the balance between humans and the natural world began to shift in ways that would eventually shape the course of human history itself. Long before cities rose from stone and steel, before fields were planted and harvests stored for winter, humans lived in a world that felt far larger and far more uncertain than the one we know today. The landscapes were open and untamed, shaped by wind, ice, and the steady migrations of animals that had ruled the earth for ages. Among those animals were the giants. Across frozen plains, mammoths traveled in slow, deliberate herds, their massive bodies moving through drifting snow as they followed ancient routes carved into the memory of their species. In forested valleys, giant ground sloths moved quietly among the trees, pulling branches downward with powerful limbs. On open grasslands, enormous bison gathered in dark clusters that stretched toward the horizon. And somewhere within these same landscapes walked small groups of humans. They did not dominate the world yet. They had no cities, no walls, no machines to reshape the land. Their survival depended on observation and cooperation, on learning the rhythms of the animals and the seasons. They followed rivers, watched the sky, and studied the tracks left behind by creatures far larger than themselves. To live in that world required patience. Early humans would have seen the giants not only as sources of food, but as forces within the environment. A herd of mammoths passing through a valley could reshape the land with its movement. Trees snapped under their weight. Paths formed where their feet pressed into the soil. Even the sound of their steps must have carried across great distances. Imagine standing beside a small fire at the edge of an open plain and watching such animals appear on the horizon. The experience would have been both awe-inspiring and unsettling. These creatures were powerful enough to crush a human, yet they were also essential to survival. A successful hunt could provide an enormous supply of food, fat, and materials that might sustain a community through an entire season. But hunting animals of such size was never simple. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans did sometimes hunt megafauna, but these encounters were likely rare and carefully planned. Stone spear points, discovered alongside ancient bones, hint at moments when humans managed to bring down creatures that outweighed them many times over. Such hunts would have required extraordinary coordination. Hunters may have studied the movements of a herd for days or weeks before attempting an attack. They might have used terrain to their advantage, guiding animals toward natural traps or steep ground where escape became difficult. Every movement had to be precise. A single mistake could mean injury or death. In this way, the presence of giants may have shaped the development of human intelligence. To face animals of such scale, humans needed to communicate clearly with one another. Plans had to be formed and remembered. Knowledge about animal behavior had to be shared between generations. The act of hunting megafauna encouraged cooperation, strategy, and foresight. These are the very traits that later defined human societies. Seen from this perspective, the relationship between humans and the giants was not simply a struggle between predator and prey. It was a dynamic interaction that influenced both sides. Humans learned to adapt, and the animals themselves responded to the presence of these new hunters. For thousands of years, the two shared the same landscapes. Humans followed migration routes shaped by herds. They studied the movements of animals and used that knowledge to navigate vast territories. The giants were not merely creatures within the environment. They were part of the living world that early humans depended upon. Yet as time passed, this shared world began to change. The giants gradually vanished, leaving behind landscapes that would soon belong primarily to humans. And once those enormous animals were gone, the influence they had once held over human survival and culture began to fade as well. Which raises a deeper question that continues to echo through the study of prehistory. If humans once lived alongside these immense creatures, how deeply did the giants shape the earliest strategies, traditions, and ways of life that allowed our species to survive? For early humans, survival depended on understanding the world around them. Every landscape held opportunities, but also risks. Weather could turn harsh without warning. Food sources could disappear as seasons changed. In such an uncertain environment, knowledge was the most valuable tool a community possessed. And much of that knowledge came from watching the giants. Megafauna were not simply animals moving through the environment. They were central pillars of the Ice Age world. Their migrations, feeding habits, and seasonal movements shaped the landscapes that humans depended upon. By observing these animals, early humans learned how to navigate environments that might otherwise have been impossible to survive. The most obvious connection between humans and megafauna was food. A successful hunt of a large animal could transform the fortunes of an entire group. A single mammoth carried enormous stores of energy. Its meat alone could feed dozens of people for many days. But the value of such an animal extended far beyond food. Early humans learned to use nearly every part of these creatures. Thick hides could be stretched across wooden frames to create shelters capable of withstanding freezing winds. In the cold climates of the Ice Age, such protection meant the difference between life and death. Bones, once cleaned and shaped, became tools, spear points, needles, and structural supports. In some Ice Age settlements discovered across parts of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of dwellings constructed using mammoth bones as frames. These structures were then covered with hides, creating sturdy shelters capable of protecting families from the harsh conditions of the northern plains. Even fat played a critical role. Rendered animal fat could burn slowly as fuel, producing light and warmth inside shelters during long winter nights. It also provided essential calories in a world where energy was often scarce. Yet the relationship between humans and the giants was not limited to hunting. Early humans were also careful observers of the natural world. They watched how animals moved through landscapes and learned from those movements. Migrating herds revealed the changing seasons. When mammoths or bison traveled towards certain valleys or rivers, humans understood that food and water would likely be found there as well. Predators provided lessons too. Watching wolves track prey across snow-covered plains may have taught early hunters strategies for following animal trails. Observing how large herbivores grazed or sheltered during storms could reveal which areas of land offered the best protection from harsh weather. In this way, megafauna were more than sources of material resources. They were guides within the environment. Their presence shaped migration routes that humans eventually followed. Paths formed by herds became natural corridors across vast territories. Valleys rich with grazing animals often became gathering places where human groups returned year after year. Over time, these patterns may have influenced the development of early cultural traditions. Knowledge about where animals moved when they migrated and how they behaved needed to be shared between generations. Stories, symbols, and early forms of communication likely helped preserve this information, allowing younger members of the group to learn from those who had survived previous seasons. The giants were therefore woven deeply into the fabric of prehistoric human life. They provided food, materials, and knowledge about the landscapes that sustained both species. For early humans, understanding the behavior of these animals was not a curiosity, it was a necessity. Without that knowledge, survival would have been far more difficult. Seen through this lens, the giants of the Ice Age were not simply creatures that humans hunted. They were part of the living system that shaped human adaptation and learning. And when those giants eventually disappeared, the consequences would have reached far beyond the natural world, because removing such powerful influences from the environment may have altered the path of human history in ways we are only beginning to understand. For countless generations, early humans lived in a world shaped by the presence of giants. Mammoths crossed the plains along ancient migration routes. Enormous bison gathered in vast herds. Giant sloths moved slowly through forests that seemed endless. These animals were not distant curiosities. They were part of the daily reality of survival. Then, slowly at first, the giants began to disappear. The change would not have felt sudden to the people living through it. It likely unfolded over many generations. A valley that once held herds each winter might gradually fall silent. Hunting routes that had fed families for years might grow less reliable. The animals did not vanish overnight. Instead, they became fewer, more distant, harder to find. For early human communities, this shift required adaptation. Without the great herds of megafauna moving through the landscape, hunters began turning their attention to smaller animals. Deer, antelope, and other medium-sized prey became increasingly important sources of food. Hunting strategies evolved to match these new targets. Weapons grew more refined, tools more specialized. The disappearance of the giants may have forced humans to become more flexible in their approach to survival. Smaller prey required different tactics. Instead of coordinated hunts aimed at massive animals, smaller groups could track individual animals through forests and across hills. Spears became lighter and easier to throw. Eventually, new technologies such as bows, arrows, and traps began to appear in some regions. Human ingenuity expanded as the environment changed. At the same time, landscapes themselves were transforming. Without large herbivores constantly grazing vegetation, grasslands in many regions slowly began to shift. Forests expanded into open plains. Shrubs and young trees filled spaces that once remained clear beneath the movement of grazing herds. For humans, these environmental changes created both challenges and opportunities. Dense forests provided new sources of food, including fruits, nuts, and smaller animals adapted to wooded environments. Rivers and wetlands supported fish and waterfowl. Communities gradually diversified their diets, learning to harvest a wider variety of resources from their surroundings. Over time, some groups began experimenting with entirely new ways of living, rather than following migrating herds across vast territories. Certain communities started settling in regions where food sources were abundant year-round. These early experiments in more stable living eventually laid the groundwork for agriculture, where humans would begin cultivating plants instead of relying entirely on wild ecosystems. The disappearance of megafauna may not have directly caused agriculture, but it likely changed the balance of survival strategies available to early humans. As the giants faded from the landscape, humanity began shaping the environment in new ways. Yet even as ecosystems transformed and survival strategies evolved, the memory of those ancient animals may not have vanished entirely. Stories passed from one generation to the next could have preserved fragments of encounters with creatures that younger generations had never seen themselves. Over time, such memories may have changed. Details softened. Real animals became larger or stranger in the retelling. The memory of a mammoth might evolve into a story of an enormous beast that once roamed the plains long ago. Encounters with giant predators might transform into legends about powerful creatures from an earlier age. In this way, echoes of the giants could have survived within myth and folklore. Whether these connections are real or simply reflections of human imagination remains difficult to prove. But the possibility reveals something important about the deep relationship between humans and the prehistoric world. The giants were not merely background figures in human history. They shaped the landscapes our ancestors walked across. They influenced the tools humans created, the strategies they used to hunt, and the knowledge they passed to future generations. When those animals disappeared, the world changed. Human societies adapted, ecosystems shifted, and new forms of civilization slowly emerged from the altered landscapes of the post-Ice Age world. The giants left the Earth, but their presence remained woven into the earliest chapters of human history. And even today, as scientists continue to search for new fossils and forgotten evidence, one question quietly persists. Are we certain that every trace of those ancient giants has already been discovered? For more than 2 centuries, scientists have searched the Earth for traces of ancient life. Expeditions have crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and excavated riverbanks in the hope of uncovering bones buried deep within stone. Museums around the world now hold vast collections of fossils, each one a fragment of a world that vanished long ago. At first glance, it can feel as though the story of prehistoric life has already been written. But the deeper researchers look into the fossil record, the clearer a surprising truth becomes. What we know about ancient life represents only a small fraction of what once existed. The prehistoric world was far more diverse, far more complex than the fragments we have uncovered so far. The reason lies in the rarity of fossilization itself. When an animal dies, its body usually returns to the environment very quickly. Scavengers consume the remains. Bacteria and fungi break down soft tissues. Wind, rain, and sunlight gradually scatter bones across the landscape. Within a short time, little evidence remains that the creature ever existed. For a fossil to form, a series of unlikely conditions must occur. The body must be buried rapidly, often beneath mud, sand, or volcanic ash. This burial protects the remains from scavengers and slows the natural process of decay. Over time, minerals carried by groundwater seep into the bones or shells, slowly replacing organic material with stone. Layer by layer, sediment hardens around the remains, preserving them for thousands or even millions of years. Even under ideal conditions, fossilization is rare. Many ecosystems leave almost no fossil record at all. Tropical forests, for example, tend to recycle organic material quickly, leaving few preserved remains behind. Entire communities of animals may have lived and disappeared without leaving a single fossil to mark their presence. And even when fossils do form, they may remain hidden far beneath the surface of the Earth. Tectonic forces slowly move continents, raising some rock layers while burying others deeper underground. Sediment accumulates across ancient landscapes, sealing fossils beneath kilometers of stone. Rivers shift their courses, and forests grow over regions where prehistoric bones still lie waiting. Remote mountain valleys have never been systematically surveyed. Beneath dense forests and beneath the oceans themselves, layers of sediment still hold secrets from ancient ecosystems that have yet to be revealed. Even the fossils already discovered do not always give up their stories immediately. Museum collections contain countless bones gathered during expeditions decades ago. Many of these specimens were catalogued and stored before modern analytical techniques existed. Only recently have researchers begun re-examining some of these materials using advanced imaging, chemical analysis, and digital modeling. Sometimes these re-examinations lead to unexpected discoveries. A bone long believed to belong to a familiar species may turn out to represent an entirely new branch of evolutionary history. A fragment overlooked in a drawer might reveal a creature no one realized had existed. Each year, scientists announce new species identified from fossils that were collected long ago, but only now fully understood. These discoveries serve as a reminder that the prehistoric record is not a finished archive. It is more like a vast puzzle scattered across the planet, with most of its pieces still missing. The bones we have uncovered provide glimpses of ancient worlds, but they cannot yet show us the full picture. Some of the giants of the past are known only through fragments. Others may remain entirely undiscovered, their remains still buried beneath layers of earth and time. In that sense, the story of prehistoric life is still unfolding, and somewhere beneath deserts, forests, or ancient seabeds, the next major discovery, may already be waiting quietly within the stone, hidden until someone happens to look in exactly the right place. Across the planet, there are places where the past rests unusually close to the surface. In these landscapes, ancient bones lie preserved beneath layers of sediment, waiting quietly beneath the modern world. Some of the most extraordinary discoveries of prehistoric life have emerged from environments where nature itself acted as a careful archivist. Deserts are among the most remarkable of these places. In dry regions, where rainfall is rare and vegetation sparse, the ground often remains undisturbed for long periods. Wind slowly removes layers of sand and soil, sometimes revealing fossils that have been hidden for millions of years. In parts of Mongolia, Argentina, and North Africa, paleontologists have uncovered vast deposits of ancient bones scattered across barren plains where entire prehistoric ecosystems once thrived. Rivers constantly reshape the landscapes they flow through, cutting into older rock layers and exposing sediments that were buried long ago. Along eroding riverbanks, fragments of bone sometimes appear in the exposed earth. A careful observer might notice a curve of fossilized ivory or the worn edge of a prehistoric tooth emerging from the soil. Some of the most dramatic discoveries have occurred in ancient lake beds. Thousands of years ago, lakes often formed in valleys carved by glaciers or tectonic movement. Over time, sediments slowly settled at the bottom of these waters, gently covering the remains of animals that died nearby. When the lakes eventually dried out or shifted their boundaries, those sediments hardened into layers, rich with preserved fossils. In a few rare locations, these deposits reveal extraordinary scenes from the distant past. Entire herds of animals may appear together in the fossil record, as if frozen in time. Some scientists believe such deposits formed during moments of environmental stress, when droughts or sudden floods gathered animals in the same place. Others suggest that natural traps, such as mud pits or collapsing riverbanks, may have captured groups of animals at once. Whatever the cause, these mass fossil sites provide an unusually detailed glimpse into prehistoric ecosystems. Yet, even as paleontologists uncover such remarkable discoveries, they are acutely aware of how much remains hidden. The regions where fossils have already been found represent only a small portion of the planet. Vast areas of Earth remain largely unexplored from a paleontological perspective. Dense tropical forests conceal ancient sediments beneath layers of vegetation and soil. Remote mountain ranges hold rock formations that few researchers have ever examined closely. Even beneath the oceans, prehistoric landscapes lie preserved. During the Ice Age, sea levels were far lower than they are today. Large areas of land that once supported animals and human communities now rest beneath coastal waters. River valleys, plains, and shorelines from that distant time remain submerged, hidden beneath layers of marine sediment. Exploring these environments presents enormous challenges, but modern technology is beginning to reveal new possibility. Ground-penetrating radar allows researchers to scan beneath the surface without disturbing the soil, identifying buried structures and geological layers that might contain fossils. Satellite imagery provides a broader view of landscapes, highlighting subtle patterns in terrain that could indicate ancient riverbeds or sediment deposits where fossils are more likely to appear. By combining these tools with traditional fieldwork, scientists are slowly mapping regions that were once impossible to study. Each new discovery reminds researchers that the prehistoric world was far larger and more diverse than the fragments we currently possess. The bones displayed in museums represent only the pieces that chance and persistence have uncovered so far. Beneath deserts, forests, mountains, and oceans, countless other remains may still be waiting. Each one has the potential to reveal a new species, a forgotten ecosystem, or a detail about ancient life that reshapes our understanding of the past. The deeper scientists explore, the clearer it becomes that the story of Earth's giants is not finished. Hidden beneath the surface of the planet are still unread chapters of natural history, waiting patiently for the moment when someone finally uncovers them. For a long time, the story of prehistoric giants seemed relatively simple. Scientists believed they understood the main characters, the environments they inhabited, and the moment when their presence faded from the Earth. Mammoths, Giant sloths, enormous bison. These animals appeared in textbooks as powerful symbols of a distant age that had already been carefully reconstructed. But scientific knowledge rarely remains fixed for long. Each decade brings new discoveries, and with them new questions. Fossils uncovered in unexpected places sometimes reveal species no one previously imagined. Bones examined with modern technology can expose details that earlier researchers could not detect. Gradually, the familiar narrative begins to shift. The story of the giants is not being replaced, but refined. A bone discovered in a remote valley might extend the known range of a species across an entire continent. A fragment of DNA preserved inside fossilized remains can reveal unexpected relationships between animals once believed unrelated. In some cases, a single discovery forces scientists to reconsider how entire ecosystems once functioned. These moments of revision are not signs that earlier research was wrong. Instead, they reflect the nature of science itself. Knowledge grows through careful accumulation. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, allowing researchers to view the past with greater clarity than before. Sometimes that clarity confirms what scientists suspected all along. At other times, it reveals patterns that no one anticipated. The study of megafauna has entered a particularly dynamic phase in recent years. New technologies are allowing scientists to examine ancient remains in ways that would have been impossible only a generation ago. Genetic analysis can extract fragments of DNA preserved inside bones and teeth, offering glimpses into the evolutionary history of species that vanished thousands of years ago. These genetic traces can reveal how different populations were connected across vast regions. They can show whether isolated groups survived longer than expected, or whether environmental pressures forced species to migrate before their final disappearance. At the same time, climate scientists are reconstructing ancient weather patterns with increasing precision. Ice cores, ocean sediments, and geological records are being combined to model how temperatures and rainfall shifted during the final stages of the Ice Age. When these climate models are compared with fossil evidence, a more detailed picture of ancient ecosystems begins to emerge. Researchers can now trace how changing environments influenced animal migrations, plant growth, and the availability of resources across entire continents. Archaeological discoveries add another layer to this reconstruction, revealing how early human communities moved through these same landscapes. By weaving together fossil evidence, climate data, and human history, scientists are gradually reconstructing a world far more complex than anyone once imagined. The giants of the Ice Age were not isolated wonders, roaming empty wilderness. They were part of intricate ecological networks. Their presence influenced plant communities, predator populations, and even the ways humans learn to survive in challenging environments. Understanding that network requires cooperation between many fields of research. Paleontologists study the bones themselves. Geneticists analyze fragments of ancient DNA. Climate scientists reconstruct the environments those animals once inhabited. Archaeologists search for traces of human activity that might reveal how our ancestors interacted with the giants around them. Together, these perspectives form a broader and more nuanced view of the past. Each new discovery reshapes the narrative slightly, adding depth and detail to a story that once seemed almost complete. And perhaps the most fascinating realization is this: the story is still unfolding. Some of the most important fossils have yet to be discovered. Genetic techniques continue to improve, revealing information hidden within bones that have rested in museum collections for decades. New field expeditions are constantly exploring landscapes where no one has searched before. With every discovery, the history of Earth's giants becomes a little clearer, yet it also becomes more mysterious. Because the deeper scientists explore the past, the more they realize how profoundly those ancient animals shaped the world we now inhabit, and how much their disappearance changed the course of life on this planet. The giants are gone, but their story is still being written. And as the final chapters of that story begin to unfold, a deeper question quietly emerges. What might the disappearance of those immense creatures reveal about the fragile balance that governs life on Earth today, and the future that lies ahead? For much of human history, the world has appeared stable. Mountains stand where they always have. Forests return each spring. Rivers follow the same valleys carved long ago. To those living within a single lifetime, the planet often feels permanent, as though its landscapes and climates are fixed features of existence. But when scientists look deeper into Earth's past, a very different picture begins to emerge. The stability we experience is often an illusion created by the short span of human time. Across geological history, the planet has repeatedly transformed itself. Oceans have expanded and retreated. Ice sheets have grown to cover continents, and then vanished again. Entire ecosystems have appeared, flourished for thousands of years, and then disappeared almost entirely. The Ice Age world that supported mammoths, giant sloths, and countless other megafauna once seemed just as stable as the environments we know today. For tens of thousands of years, the mammoth steppe stretched across enormous portions of the northern hemisphere. Herds of giant animals followed predictable migration routes across grasslands that returned each growing season. To any human living during those long periods of stability, it might have seemed as though the world would always remain that way. Yet the geological record tells another story. When scientists began drilling deep cores from ancient glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, they discovered that Earth's climate has not always changed slowly. Encased within layers of ice are tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere, each one preserving a snapshot of conditions from thousands of years ago. By analyzing these frozen archives, researchers have identified periods when global temperatures shifted with surprising speed. In some cases, the climate appears to have warmed or cooled dramatically within only a few decades. Such changes would have altered rainfall patterns, vegetation growth, and seasonal cycles across entire continents. For ecosystems built on long-standing environmental balance, such rapid change could be deeply disruptive. Plants that once thrived in cold conditions might struggle as temperatures rise. Forests could expand into areas previously dominated by grasslands. Rivers fed by melting glaciers might surge or disappear, depending on shifting precipitation. Animals living within those ecosystems would be forced to adapt quickly or move in search of suitable habitat. For smaller species with short lifespans and rapid reproduction cycles, adaptation might be possible. Over generations, populations can adjust to new conditions through natural selection. But large animals face a more difficult challenge. Megafauna reproduce slowly. They require vast territories and stable food supplies to support their enormous bodies. When ecosystems change rapidly, such species often lack the time necessary to evolve new strategies for survival. This vulnerability may help explain why the disappearance of Ice Age giants occurred during a period of intense environmental instability. The world they were adapted to began shifting faster than they could follow. The grasslands that once sustained enormous herds transformed into forests or wetlands. Migration routes changed as rivers and coastlines moved. Combined with other pressures, including human expansion, these environmental changes created conditions that many megafauna populations could not overcome. Yet the disappearance of the giants was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern that has repeated throughout the long history of life on Earth. Extinction events have occurred many times before, often during periods when climate, geology, and ecosystems shifted simultaneously. Each time, the planet eventually recovered. New species evolved. Ecosystems reorganized themselves. Life continued along new evolutionary paths, shaped by the conditions that followed. Seen from this perspective, the extinction of megafauna becomes more than a story about ancient animals. It becomes a reminder of how dynamic the Earth truly is. The landscapes we see today are not permanent structures. They are temporary chapters in a much longer story of planetary transformation. And once that realization begins to settle in, a new question naturally follows. If environmental change reshaped ecosystems so dramatically in the past, how might the living world respond when similar changes unfold in the present day? When scientists study the long history of life on Earth, they often describe it as a series of chapters separated by moments of profound loss. These moments are known as mass extinctions, periods when large numbers of species disappeared within relatively short spans of geological time. 5. Such events are clearly recorded in the fossil record. The most famous occurred about 66 million years ago, when an asteroid struck the Earth and contributed to the extinction of the dinosaurs. Earlier events were triggered by enormous volcanic eruptions, shifts in ocean chemistry, or dramatic climate changes that transformed the planet's ecosystems. Each of these extinctions reshaped the trajectory of life. After every collapse, new species eventually evolved to fill the spaces left behind. Entire groups of organisms rose to prominence in the aftermath of those losses. Mammals, for example, began their great expansion only after the extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs. Today, some scientists believe the planet may be entering another period of accelerated extinction. This idea is sometimes referred to as the sixth mass extinction. Unlike the previous 5 events, which were driven primarily by natural forces, this one may be influenced heavily by the activities of a single species. Human expansion across the planet has transformed landscapes at an unprecedented pace. Forests are cleared to create farmland and cities. Rivers are redirected. Oceans absorb increasing levels of pollution. These changes alter the habitats that many species depend upon for survival. Animals that require large territories are particularly vulnerable. Elephants, large carnivores, and other wide-ranging species often struggle when their habitats become fragmented by roads, settlements, and agriculture. When populations shrink, reproduction becomes more difficult, and long-term survival grows uncertain. Climate change adds another layer of complexity. As global temperatures shift, ecosystems respond in ways that echo the environmental transitions seen at the end of the Ice Age. Some species adapt by moving toward cooler regions or adjusting their life cycles. Others find themselves trapped in habitats that no longer provide the conditions they need. In many cases, the pace of change may outstrip the ability of species to adapt. Researchers tracking biodiversity have observed declines in certain populations across multiple regions of the world. Some species disappear before scientists have even had the chance to study them. Others persist only in small, isolated pockets of habitat. These patterns have led some scientists to suggest that the early stages of a new extinction event may already be unfolding. Yet the subject remains a matter of ongoing discussion. Extinction has always been part of the evolutionary process. Species appear and vanish continuously across geological time. Determining when such changes become comparable to the great extinction events of the past is not always straightforward. What is clear, however, is that the pace of environmental transformation today is unusually rapid. Human technology allows landscapes to change within decades rather than centuries. Forests that once took thousands of years to form can disappear within a single generation. Rivers can be dammed or redirected in a matter of years. These changes reshape ecosystems that many species depend upon. Seen through the lens of prehistory, the story of the Ice Age, giants, offers a powerful perspective. Mammoths, giant sloths, and countless other megafauna vanished during a period of environmental transition combined with human expansion. Their disappearance reminds us how sensitive large species can be when ecosystems shift quickly. Today's debates about biodiversity loss are not only scientific discussions, they are reflections on humanity's growing role within the Earth systems. For the first time in the planet's history, a single species possesses the ability to influence environments across nearly every continent. The question scientists now explore is not simply whether extinctions are occurring. It is how the pace of change unfolding today compares to the great transitions recorded in the fossil record, and what that comparison might reveal about the future of life on this planet. And in that comparison, the vanished giants of the Ice Age quietly return to the conversation, offering clues about the delicate balance that has always shaped life on Earth. For a long time, the giants of the Ice Age must have appeared unstoppable. Across plains, forests, and frozen tundra, mammoth, giant bison, and enormous predators shaped the living world around them. Their sheer size offered protection from many dangers. Their presence influenced the movement of herds, the growth of plants, and the balance between predator and prey. In the ecosystems they inhabited, these creatures stood at the very center of the natural order. To the smaller animals sharing those landscapes, the giants must have seemed permanent. Yet the fossil record tells a quieter, humbling story. For millions of years, megafauna dominated their environments. Their evolutionary success allowed them to spread across continents and adapt to a wide range of climates. But when the conditions that supported them began to shift, when climates changed, ecosystems reorganized and new pressures emerged, their dominance proved far less stable than it once appeared. One by one, the giants disappeared. No, because they were weak, and not because they failed to survive for immense stretches of time. They vanished because the world around them changed in ways they could not fully adapt to. This pattern appears again and again throughout Earth's history. The planet has witnessed many rulers of the natural world. Long before mammoths walked the plains, other creatures held similar positions of ecological power. Dinosaurs once dominated terrestrial ecosystems for more than 160 million years. Yet even their long reign ended when environmental conditions shifted dramatically. In each era, dominance eventually gave way to transformation. Today, humanity occupies a position unlike any species before it. Human populations now span nearly every continent. Cities rise, where forests once stood. Rivers are redirected, landscapes reshaped, and technologies extend human influence into environments that once seemed beyond reach. Satellites circle the planet, while global communication connects distant societies within moments. From one perspective, humanity has become the most powerful ecological force on Earth. Human decisions influence the atmosphere, oceans, and ecosystems on a global scale. Agriculture alters vast landscapes. Transportation networks link regions that once existed in isolation. Even the climate itself is increasingly affected by human activity. It is easy to view this position as a form of permanent control. Yet, the deeper lessons of Earth's history encourage a more reflective perspective. Dominance in nature has never been a fixed state. Every species that once appeared invincible eventually faced new conditions that challenged its survival. Environments change. Ecosystems reorganize. Evolution continues moving forward, regardless of which species currently occupies the center of the stage. The giants of the Ice Age did not vanish because they lacked strength or resilience. They disappeared because the world around them transformed faster than they could adapt. Recognizing this pattern does not imply that humanity is destined to follow the same path. Human intelligence, technology, and cultural adaptability give our species tools that no previous organism has possessed. But the history of life reminds us that no species exists outside the systems that sustain it. Human societies remain connected to the same natural processes that shaped the fate of mammoths, forests, and oceans. Climate, ecosystems, and biodiversity continue to influence the stability of the world we inhabit. The story of the giants therefore offers something more than a tale of vanished animals. It offers perspective. For a brief moment in geological time, mammoths and other megafauna defined the landscapes of Earth. Their presence shaped entire ecosystems and influenced the lives of early humans. Yet, even their immense strength could not guarantee permanence. Understanding that history invites a quiet question: if dominance in nature is always temporary, perhaps the most important challenge for humanity is not how to rule the Earth, but how to live within its ever-changing balance. And with that thought, the story of the giants begins to widen into something even larger than extinction itself, a reflection on the long, unfolding journey of life on this restless planet. Imagine standing on a wide plain at the edge of winter. The wind moves slowly across the grass, carrying the cold scent of distant snow. The sky stretches outward in a pale horizon, and the land feels open in a way that is difficult to experience in the modern world. There are no highways cutting through the valley, no cities glowing in the distance, only the quiet rhythm of the natural world moving through another season. And then, slowly, shapes appear on the horizon. At first they look like moving hills, dark forms rising and falling as they approach across the plain. But as the distance closes, their outlines become clearer. Massive bodies covered in long fur move in steady formation. Curving ivory tusks catch the light as enormous animals step forward through the frost. A herd of mammoths crosses the landscape. Their movement is deliberate, almost ancient in its patience. Each step presses deep into the earth, leaving tracks that smaller animals will follow later. Younger calves walk close to the center of the herd, while larger adults guard the edges, watching the open land for danger. Scenes like this were once common across vast regions of the earth. For thousands of generations, landscapes that now appear quiet were filled with giants. Mammoths traveled across frozen plains. Giant ground sloths wandered slowly through forests, pulling branches downward to feed. Saber-toothed predators moved carefully through tall grass, watching for moments when an unwary animal drifted too far from its herd. These creatures were not rare or mythical. They were part of the living world. Entire ecosystems revolved around their presence. Grasslands were shaped by the grazing of enormous herbivores. Predators followed the migrations of large prey. Rivers and forests felt the influence of animals powerful enough to push over trees or carve pathways through dense vegetation. If those giants still lived today, the planet might feel profoundly different. Imagine driving across a modern grassland and seeing mammoths moving slowly across the horizon. Imagine national parks where giant bison herds thunder across open plains while enormous predators watch from distant ridges. Even forests might feel different, with massive animals opening pathways through trees and reshaping vegetation. Human societies might also have followed a different path. Cities and farms would have developed alongside animals far larger than anything we encounter today. Highways and railways might have been designed to avoid ancient migration routes. Entire regions of land might remain wild, simply because sharing space with such creatures required caution and respect. It is difficult to say exactly how civilization would have changed, but the presence of giants would certainly remind us that humanity is not the only powerful force within the natural world. Instead, our species would still be sharing the planet with animals capable of transforming entire landscapes through their movement alone. Of course, the world we inhabit now is quieter. The great herds are gone. The mammoth steppe has faded into memory preserved only through fossils, ancient sediments, and fragments of genetic code hidden within surviving relatives. Yet the echoes of that era remain. The bones preserved in museums tell the story of animals that once stood taller than elephants. The open plains that stretch across continents still carry the imprint of ecosystems shaped by enormous grazers long ago. Even modern species, elephants, bison, and others, carry faint genetic reminders of a time when their relatives were far larger and more numerous. The age of giants is no longer part of the living world. But it was real. And when we imagine those ancient landscapes one last time, vast plains, slow-moving herds, predators waiting in the tall grass, we begin to understand just how extraordinary the Earth once was. Which invites a final widening of perspective, because the story of the giants is only one chapter in a far longer history. If we step back far enough, the story of the giants begins to look different. Mammoth, saber-toothed cats, and giant sloths feel ancient when viewed through the lens of human history. They lived long before cities, before agriculture, before written language. Yet, on the scale of Earth's deep timeline, their age was only a recent moment. Our planet has existed for more than 4 billion years. During that immense span of time, the surface of the Earth has transformed again and again. Continents have drifted across the globe like slow-moving islands of stone. Oceans have opened and closed. Mountains have risen and worn down until they disappeared into plains. Life, too, has passed through countless transformations. The earliest organisms were microscopic, living quietly within ancient oceans, billions of years ago. Over unimaginable stretches of time, those simple forms evolved into more complex life. Eventually, the seas filled with strange creatures, unlike anything alive today. Long before the age of mammals, ancient oceans were home to trilobites, armored arthropods that crawled across the seafloor in enormous numbers. Coral reefs formed vast underwater ecosystems filled with unfamiliar fish and invertebrates. Entire worlds of marine life appeared and vanished as the chemistry of the oceans changed. Later, forests. Hundreds of millions of years ago, enormous ferns and towering clumos trees formed dense jungles that stretched across warm, humid landscapes. These ancient forests looked nothing like the woodlands of today. Insects grew to extraordinary sizes, some with wings wider than modern birds, moving through thick vegetation under a sky heavy with moisture. Then came another transformation. Reptiles evolved into creatures that would eventually dominate the planet for more than 160 million years. Dinosaurs walked across nearly every continent, filling ecological roles from small hunters to massive plant eaters that reshaped entire landscapes through their movement. For an immense span of time, the world belonged to them. Yet, even the dinosaurs did not rule forever. A sudden catastrophe near the end of the Cretaceous period brought their long reign to a close. An asteroid struck the Earth, triggering environmental changes that caused many species to disappear. In the aftermath of that extinction, new forms of life emerged to fill the empty ecological spaces. Among them were the early ancestors of mammals. Gradually, over millions of years, mammals diversified into a wide range of species. Some became swift predators, others powerful grazers. Eventually, in the colder climates of the Ice Age, some mammals grew to enormous sizes, giving rise to the giants we have been exploring throughout this journey. Mammoths, the giant bison, and massive ground sloths were the dominant animals of their time. Yet even their era was temporary. When environmental conditions changed and ecosystems reorganized, those giants disappeared, just as other rulers of the natural world had vanished before them. Seen through this wider perspective, extinction does not mark the end of life's story. Instead, it is part of an ongoing cycle of transformation. When one group fades away, others evolve to take their place. New ecosystems form. New relationships between species emerge. The planet continues its long experiment with life, endlessly reshaping the living world. The giants of the Ice Age were not the first dominant creatures to vanish, and they will not be the last. They were simply one chapter within a story that stretches across billions of years. And when we begin to see Earth through that immense timeline, another realization slowly comes into focus. Humanity itself now occupies a place within that same unfolding story, a species that has only just appeared in the vast history of life on this restless planet. In quiet laboratories and windswept excavation sites around the world, scientists continue a remarkable task. They study fragments of bone, grains of sediment, and traces of ancient DNA, searching for clues about lives that ended thousands or even millions of years ago. Piece by piece, they attempt to reconstruct worlds that vanished long before human civilization ever appeared. Through this work, humanity has become something unique in the long history of life. For billions of years, organisms lived and disappeared without ever understanding the planet they inhabited. Creatures adapted to changing environments, evolved into new forms, and vanished when conditions shifted beyond their ability to survive. The cycles of life continued endlessly, guided only by the quiet processes of evolution and natural change. But now, for the first time, one species has begun to look backward. By studying fossils preserved in ancient rock, humans have gained the ability to glimpse entire chapters of Earth's history. We can trace the rise and fall of ecosystems, observe how climates transformed landscapes, and learn how species once adapted to environments that no longer exist. Through these discoveries, the giants of the Ice Age have returned, not in living form, but as stories written in stone. Mammoths that once walked across frozen plains now stand reconstructed within museums. Giant sloths and saber-toothed predators appear again through careful scientific illustration and digital modeling. Even fragments of ancient DNA allow researchers to peer into the biological relationships that connected those animals to species living today. Each fossil tells part of a story that might otherwise have been forgotten. And as those stories accumulate, they reveal something profound about humanity's place within the natural world. Unlike the megafauna that once dominated prehistoric ecosystems, humans possess the rare ability to understand the forces shaping their environment. We can study climate patterns stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. We can analyze how ecosystems respond to change. We can recognize the delicate balance that allows life to flourish on this planet. This awareness creates both responsibility and possibility. The giants of the past lived entirely within the conditions of their time. When those conditions shifted, they had no way to anticipate the changes unfolding around them. Their fate was determined by forces beyond their awareness. Humanity, by contrast, now holds knowledge that earlier species never possessed. We can see how environmental change reshaped the Ice Age world. We can understand how ecosystems depend on countless interactions between species and climate. The disappearance of megafauna offers more than a scientific mystery. It provides insight into how life responds when those systems fall out of balance. In this way, the story of the giants becomes something more than a tale of extinction. It becomes a lesson about adaptation, resilience, and awareness. The fossil record reminds us that Earth has never remained still. Landscapes shift, climates transform, and the living world evolves in response to new conditions. Each era leaves behind traces that future generations may one day study and interpret. Right now, humanity stands within one of those chapters. All species has emerged during a brief moment in the planet's immense timeline, armed with tools capable of exploring both the distant past and the unfolding future. Satellites circle the Earth, laboratories decode ancient DNA, and explorers continue, searching for fossils buried beneath deserts, forests, and oceans. The story of life is still being written. The giants of prehistory have vanished from the living world, yet their presence continues to shape our understanding of the planet we inhabit. They remind us that the Earth has hosted many different worlds before our own, each one rising, transforming, and eventually giving way to something new. And somewhere within that long unfolding narrative, humanity has now become one of the characters shaping the next chapter. The giants are gone, but the story of life on Earth is far from finished.